Good evening, everyone. Kalisperas. Welcome. Welcome to the Greek Community of Melbourne's History and Culture public seminar series. And just before we commence tonight's proceeding, just some household items that we need to cover. Just a reminder that next week's seminar will be by Professor Thanos Veremis, who's based in Athens, and it will be on the 1821 Greek Revolution. That's the 15th of April. The following week, April the 22nd, we return back to the mezzanine. So from the 22nd of April onwards, all seminars will be hybrid seminars. You've got the option of either turning up in person, the mezzanine level, and simultaneously there is broadcast on Zoom, Facebook, and other sort of social media. So you have the option of one or the other from the 22nd onwards. You don't have access to the mezzanine at the moment as the comedy festival is on. So where the speakers are local, it will be held at the mezzanine level, or even if they're overseas based, we will be screening it on the large screen. So from the 22nd of April onwards, we're going to try and make all our seminars a hybrid sort of format. Okay, let's return to tonight's seminar, which is on the forgotten city of ancient Thebes. In today's seminar, the mythic origins and enduring legacy of the ancient Greek city of Thebes will be explored. Though frequently overshadowed by its more illustrious rival city-states, Athens and Sparta, Thebes played an integral role in the achievements and culture of ancient Greece. Our speaker tonight will bring the city back to life through the myths of Oedipus and Heracles, the dramas of Pindar and Sophocles, and the histories of Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and Plutarch. Though Thebes committed treachery by siding with Persia in its invasion of Greece in 480 BC, Theban soldiers fought alongside the Spartan army at the Battle of Thebes. Liberated from Athenian rule by Sparta's victory in the Peloponnesian War, Thebes became the single greatest power and power broker of mainland Greece between 371 and 362 BC, until it was destroyed by Alexander the Great in 335 BC. It was eventually refounded and flourished in relative peace, the Roman, Byzantine, and later Ottoman rule. Our deeply informed presenter tonight will attempt to restore Thebes to its rightful place in history. A few words about our invited guest tonight, Professor Paul Cartledge. It's not only an immense honor to introduce him, but also I feel it's quite a coup to have Professor Cartledge with us tonight. In this respect, I'd like to thank our sponsor for tonight's seminar, Joseph Telanidis from the Australian Hellenic Lawyers Association, who facilitated this mission. Themes had definitely fallen off my radar, and this is one of the driving forces of the seminar series, to get peripheral topics on the radar, not just the well-known ones, especially in the area of classical studies. Professor Paul Cartledge is the A.G. Leventis Senior Research Fellow of Clare College, the University of Cambridge. He's the author and co-author and editor or co-editor of some 30 books, with the latest being Thebes, Forgotten City of Ancient Greece, which came out last year, published by Picador. Those on our mailing list would have received an email regarding the release of this book and where to sort of purchase it from as well. Definitely recommend it. Professor Cartledge's field of study is ancient Athens and Sparta in the classical age. He's been described as a Laconophile. He was a chief historical consultant for the BBC TV series The Greeks and the Channel 4 series The Spartans by Bettany Hughes. Professor Cartledge is also the holder of the Gold Cross of the Order of Honor of Greece and an Honorary Citizen of modern Sparta. Most recently, very recently, he's been awarded the Commander of the Order of Honor. In Greek is Tαξιάρχης της Τιμῆς, for his contribution to enhancing Greece's stature abroad. So he's quite a philhellene, and it's a pleasure to have him with us tonight. I pass on the baton to Professor Cartledge. Professor Cartledge, the floor is yours, and welcome once again.
Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can all hear me. It's a real pleasure here in the morning, of course, in England, in Cambridge, to address you down under. I'm deeply regretful that despite having been invited several times, and indeed having former students in many Australian universities, including at Brisbane, I've not yet managed, and I don't think now, given my advanced age, I'm ever going to sadly make it physically down to Melbourne, which I would, of course, have loved to do. So thank heavens for Zoom. We can at least make what we can of what we have. So let me, if I may, first of all, utter a couple of votes of thanks. First of all, of course, to the Greek community of Melbourne for inviting me to give this talk, and especially to Nick. Nick, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for making this possible and for your very generous introduction. Thank you. And secondly, to our sponsor, in the sense that probably without his generosity, it would not have been possible, Joseph Salgenis. Thank you very much indeed, Joseph. May I have now my screen? Do I need to share again, or can you just flick over onto my screen?
You need to initiate the sharing yourself.
Do the sharing again, okay. So you'll notice here from my first slide, the slight difference, one word difference in the title from the one that you were given, which is of course the title of my book, The Forgotten City of Ancient Greece. Here I've called it Lost. And I hesitated between those two for the title of the book, and in the end, Forgotten won out. And it won out, I suppose, because Thebes was lost for only 20 years, but it has been forgotten, sadly, more often than just for 20 years. Let me just explain why it was ever lost. As Nick mentioned very kindly in his introduction, in 335 BC, Alexander, who later became nicknamed the Great, Megalexandros, as the Greeks today call him, was about to set out on a conquest of the mighty, still quite mighty, Persian Empire, which at its height had extended all the way far east to the Indus Valley, to what's today Pakistan, Kashmir, that part of the world, Afghanistan in the Far East. And it had been a constant presence in the wings, as it were, for a couple of centuries before Alexander set out on his conquest. And he set out because his dad, Philip II of Macedon, had recently been assassinated, in fact, in 336. So had Philip not been assassinated, it's possible Alexander would not have become the Great, because Alexander was not due to accompany Philip on his expedition. So why then did Alexander take it into his head to have Thebes, the city of Thebes, destroyed? Because it, together with Athens, rebelled. In 338, they had been defeated by Philip. In 335, Thebes, then conquered and dominated by Macedon, rebelled. Alexander was not going to have that. And as an example, any city in mainland Greece that should even think about rebelling against him while he was off in Asia on what he called a pan-Hellenic, a kind of crusade to pay back the Persians for what they had done to Greece 140 years ago. If any city should think of rebelling, this is what was going to happen to them. They would be physically destroyed. And Alexander physically had the entire city of Thebes, with two exceptions, leveled with the ground. One exception a single private dwelling, a house, which once had been lived in by a very famous Theban poet called Pindaros, or Pindar. Now, he was a praise poet, and he composed and recited poems honoring, praising victors at all the 4 great Pan-Hellenic games, the Olympics, the Nemeans, the Pythians, and the Isthmians. So Pindar, Pan-Hellenism, Greek greatness all went together, and symbolically Alexander ordered that the house in which he had lived, where his descendants still live, should be spared. The other exemption was for all religious shrines. Alexander was very religious, we might even say superstitious. The ancient Greeks were polytheists, lots and lots of gods and goddesses, heroes and heroines were worshipped. Alexander wanted as many of them as possible to be on his side. You remember the Iliad, where the gods are divided between Troy and the Greeks. Well, Alexander was thinking of himself as a new Achilles. He was going out to take on the new Trojans, the Persian Empire. He wanted all the gods not to be divided. He wanted them on his side. So why was what had happened 140 years ago, before Alexander pitched up and went off to Asia, so relevant? Why was the treachery of Thebes in 480 used as the explanation, the justification for this really quite powerful demonstration of dislike? I think it's because Alexander was actually not entirely hugely popular throughout all Greece. I've already said that Athens and Thebes had fought together against his father. Well, in 335, Athens was still not by any means enthusiastically in favor of the expedition of Alexander. On the other hand, in 480, Athens had been right at the forefront, together with Sparta. Sparta actually was the leading member of the anti-Persian resistance in 480, and therefore it was a pan-Hellenist, an appeal to the notion of an identity of being Greek that was at the root. So the Thebans were being presented as if somehow having once been un-Greek. So that's the backdrop to why Thebes was ever lost. It was actually physically lost for about 20 years. It was resurrected, recreated from scratch. And that involved rebuilding not just private houses and public buildings, but also the walls. Walls of Thebes are rather famous. So I'm now going to take you through some slides to show you where Thebes is, and I'm going to divide the talk roughly into 2 along the lines that Nick has indicated. Namely, Thebes was in a way 2 cities. It was a city of myth. Myth in ancient Greek, mythos, means a traditional tale, typically about the gods, but also about heroes involving gods in the past. And the Thebans were particularly fertile in inventing myths. Myths of how their city came to be founded, myths about how their city developed, their early kings, and some of the names of the characters in these stories have become, well, I think we can call them household names. I can just mention one here, Oedipus. Oedipus was, though he didn't realize it, sadly for him, a Theban. His parents were king and queen of Thebes. He was born in Thebes. But there was an oracle, a Delphic oracle, that he would be a killer of his father and that he would marry his mother. Oh no, so his parents had him what the Greeks and we rather politely call exposed. The idea was that a shepherd, member of the household, the royal household, would quietly dispose of infant Oedipus. But the shepherd was kind. He couldn't bear the thought. So he handed him over to a mate of his, another shepherd who worked for another royal household. And it just so happened that royal household did not have a legitimate heir. In other words, the king and queen of Corinth were having trouble producing the needed male heir. So Oedipus was smuggled in and brought up as if he were the legitimate son of the king and queen of Corinth. And that's what he believed, that he was. The rest is, as it were, history or myth history. The other side of Thebes, and again, Nick has alluded to this already, is the history, the Thebes as a city of history. And Thebes was, though it was often overshadowed by Athens, by Sparta, by Macedon up in the north, you see on this picture, at one moment, and it's about a decade, 371, 362, the prime mover, the single most important political power, military power of mainland Greece. So I shall get to that, but I want to give you, of course, all the background first of all. So we're looking here at what sometimes is called Old Greece, Aegean Greece, because from this heartland, beginning in the 8th century, Greeks fanned out west to Sicily, South Italy, as far west eventually as France, southern France and southeast Spain, and they expanded north and east through the Dardanelles, the Hellespont as the Greeks called it, through the Bosporus, where Istanbul is, where Byzantium is, you see just on the map there, all around the Black Sea. And eventually, following the conquest of Alexander the Great, there were Greeks permanently settled in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, even in Iran, the heartland of the Persian Empire, on the Persian Gulf, and so on. So Hellas is a much bigger concept than just what we think of as the state of Greece today. And Thebes is in the center, pretty much, of mainland Greece, just north of the isthmus. Athens is to the right there, and then Thebes, you go about 90 kilometers north-northwest from Athens by sea, about 55 miles, and you come, it's less by as the crow flies. So in other words, it's a long walk, a long day's walk. You can just about do it in 12 hours or so. Quite close, in fact, in a way, too close. So this is homing in. I use on the right an old map, which is a relief map, and on the left just a schematic red blotch. The point being that you can't understand Theban history in isolation from its immediate political geography. So Thebes is one of either two, or it is the premier settlement, political entity within the region of Boeotia today, Boeotia. And the Bo bit sounds like the beginning of the Greek word for ox, bous. And so it may be something to do with the fact that there are large plains, basically two big plains, some parts of which were well watered enough to be able to raise cattle. Now, there is one feature of that map, and that I've pointed the arrow smack at it, which doesn't exist today. And yet it was one of the decisive features, actually, for the political geography of ancient Boeotia. It's Lake Cophez, which was famous in antiquity for its eels. I am speaking to you from Cambridge, which is about 11 miles or so away from a place called Ely, E-L-Y, where there's a wonderful, huge cathedral. And Ely is so named because of its eels. And it was originally an island, the Isle of Ely. And there's actually some rather wonderful myth of an English kind, that's to say, about the Saxon period. Hereward the Wake was a fenman who came from near Ely, but I'm not going to go on about that. So in the eastern part, southeastern part of Boeotia, Thebes, and then on the western flank shore of the Lake Cophez was the second city, of Boeotia, the rival city, one indeed which seems to have been perhaps originally more powerful, more important, namely Orchomenos. I've mentioned recently the destruction by Alexander of Thebes. Well, go back 30 years before that to 364, and Thebes, at the height of its hegemony of Greece, hegemonia, destroyed Orchomenos physically. So if you like, Thebes was getting a taste of its own medicine. And what it brings out, I think, is that the ancient Greeks were not always particularly friendly to each other, even if they were, or perhaps especially when they were, members of the same ethnic group. So the Boeotians were an ethnos. They spoke a Boeotian dialect of Aeolic Greek. They had common myths implying they all descended from the same ancestors and so on. And yet, they could actually physically destroy each other. And Pericles, an Athenian, the Athenians and the Thebans very rarely got on. They happened to be getting on at the time that Thebes was destroyed in the 330s. But in the 5th century, they more often did not get on. And Pericles, the famous Athenian politician and statesman, said, the Boeotians were like mutual executioners of each other. They were like tall trees that right at the top, there's a great storm, their heads crash together and they knock the tops of their heads off in the storm. Well, that, he said, was just like the Boeotians are. They're constantly knocking each other. And he had in mind, I think, one particular small Boeotian town called Plataea. Now, Plataea is famous for a number of things. It sent men to the Battle of Marathon. It's the only other Greek city apart from the Athenians who fought the famous Battle of Marathon, which was a great victory in Attica, the territory of Athens, in 490 BC. But also, Plataea was of such significance to the Athenians that it identified more with them than it did with Thebes. So that's another instance of how the Theban political situation was not always comfortable. Well, enough about that. Let me move you on. Here's another schematic map of mainland Greece, focusing on central and southern Greece, because as the heading says at the top, this is a map of Mycenaean, or what in other terms is called late Bronze Age, prehistoric Greece. Why is it called Mycenaean? Well, that's the type site. As Homer's Iliad makes clear, as the archaeology makes clear, Mycenae was the single most powerful and wealthy town. What shall we call it? It was a fortified citadel with land immediately around it of all late Bronze Age Greece. But it was not alone. Even quite close to Mycenae, in the Argolit, is Tiryns. But I'm not interested so much in that. What I am interested in is, of course, Mycenaean Boeotia and Thebes. And look up there on the western shore of Lake Cophez, Mycenaean Orchomenos. So we're talking really about the 14th, 13th centuries, between about 1400 and 1200. This is when the Mycenaean world was at its most populous, prosperous, and unified culturally. It is the background, in other words, the assumed background of the Iliad. If ever a Greek force under a king of Mycenae could have conceivably got together a big expedition to attack a city on the Hellespont, namely Troy, this was the moment, somewhere round about 1300, 1250 or so. And one reason we know something about how a Mycenaean economy and polity functioned is that for the first time, Greeks become, to us, literate as writing Greek language. we're looking at a tablet, which is baked clay, incised with symbols of a syllabary. So each symbol stands not for a single letter, but for a consonant plus a vowel or two consonants. And why is it called Linear B? Because prior to Linear B was a script found on Crete called, and it's very unimaginative, but it's called Linear A, which is not writing a Greek language or dialect. It's undecipherable, or put it another way, it's undeciphered as yet. And yet, when the inventors of Linear B came along, they borrowed a number of the signs from Linear A on Crete. And so it's thought that the first Linear B writing of Greek happened on Crete sometime around 1400 BC. From there, it was transmitted to the major palace centers of Mycenaean Greece, such as, and this is where we have Thebes. Something like 250 tablets or fragments have been found. This one lists the particular commodities of grain and wool, but others list, for example, like the ones that have recently been found near Sparta, chariots. So they record what the palace has coming in and going out in natural produce or manufactured goods. It's a centralized redistributive economy headed up by a palace with a king who is a kind of autocrat. So what do you think of? Is this like ancient Greece? Not at all. It's much more like the Middle East. And that's particularly relevant in one respect, namely that the founder of Thebes in myth is not a Greek. I mean, I don't think there is another Greek city that imagines that its original founder was not a Greek. The Thebans imagined that their founder was called Cadmos, and that's why the huge Acropolis in the center of Thebes, one of the reasons why Thebes became such an important center was that it had this natural feature of a huge Acropolis, much broader than the Athenian Acropolis, not as tall. And it's called by historical Greeks the Cadmeia, named after, and you see the name up here on the screen, the supposed founder. Now, Cadmos came from what is today Lebanon, from Tyre. And he is therefore what the Greeks called a Phoenician. Now, Phoenician means somebody who has something to do with something that's red or something to do with palm tree, a phoenix. What the Phoenicians themselves called themselves, we don't know. We don't actually know whether people from Tyre and people from Sidon thought of themselves as Phoenicians at all. It's just the Greeks called them that. Now, the reason this is important, well, there's various reasons why it's important, but one of them is that Cadmos was thought to have brought a system of writing with him to the Greeks. But what they got confused about, the ancient Greeks, is that the form of writing that they attributed to Cadmos was the alphabetic system invented in either the 9th or the 8th century after Linear B had ceased to be used and had disappeared for hundreds of years. And that indeed was borrowed from the people who were writing an alphabetic Semitic language in what we call Lebanon today, what the Greeks called Phoenicia, so Tyre and Sidon. But leave aside that, Cadmos founds Thebes. There's a terrific myth that he was the brother of a princess called Europa, whom Zeus, transforming himself into a bull, wanted, desired. And he swam over Zeus to what's today Asia Minor, to Lebanon, the Levant, and he snatched Europa brought her back on his back all the way to eventually Boeotia. Cadmos goes off in hot pursuit and then is persuaded, having found eventually Europa, to settle down, and he founds a city. Well, this is myth history, but there is a certain sort of, not exactly plausibility, but some sort of oriental flavor to the Mycenaean, that is late Bronze Age, Thebes, with its palace, with its Linear B tablets, because look at this scene on the slide. It's from a lady's toilette box, a pyxis in the classical Greek term, and it shows you two confronted sphinxes. Now, Oriental sphinxes, Egyptian sphinxes, are male. But when the Greeks get hold of sphinxes, they trans the sphinx from being male to being female. And it has a particular relevance to the episode where Oedipus, having, for whatever reason, decided to make a trip from Corinth up north to eventually Thebes. He encounters his father at a crossroads, murders him. He then is confronted on the outskirts of Thebes by a female demon, a sphinx, female sphinx, who poses a riddle to him, and there are various versions of that. He solves the riddle of the sphinx and thereby becomes king of Thebes. He rids Thebes of the threat of the sphinx. He rids Thebes of plague. He gets to marry the widow, just widowed, by Oedipus, of the man that Oedipus has just killed, Laius. He marries Jocasta. He has children with her, 4, 2 boys, 2 girls. He's therefore both their father and their half-brother. Horrors. This is all Theban mythology. And that line of thinking has been prompted by looking at a very much orientalizing or oriental type of object found on the Cadmos of Thebes from the 13th century BC. Well, now, for whatever reason, the palace of Thebes and of Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos and Knossos, you name it, was a wave of destruction throughout mainland Greece and the islands at the end or towards the end, bringing to an end the Mycenaean period, such that after 1200 BC, roughly, population levels plummet, economic levels plummet, the quality of home life, the quality of public buildings, the number of settlements, you name it, the amount of inter-regional or international trade, all those sink. And what supervenes, some of us say, is a dark age. Some would date it 11th, 10th century, so roughly between 1100 and 900, whatever. And one sign of the absolute change between the late Bronze Age palace civilization and the 8th century BC, we're looking at an object from the 8th century BC, is that in the 8th century, the Greek world is divided up into a series of polis, no longer palaces, but cities with a notion of citizenship, much smaller scale. And one of these is Thebes. And in a tomb, and you can tell that this is from a tomb because the pot is very well preserved. Normally, if a pot is entombed, is buried in a settlement site or a sanctuary site, it's just broken up into potsherds, ostraca. But in this case, it comes from a tomb. In the 8th century, the cities start to develop their own identities again, and they're starting to use, as we'll see shortly, a new form of script, which they write in local, regional forms of a new alphabet. So here we have an image on a pot. Broadly speaking, we talk about this as the geometric era. This is the late geometric. And you see a ship It's a warship because it's got a ram, if you see on the right-hand side. But on the left-hand side, a man is grasping a woman very firmly by the wrist as he seems to be embarking upon this warship. So, is this a scene of real life? Is this a captain taking just any old woman? Maybe he's like a pirate and he's snatched her, such as you read about in Homer. Or is this, and I'm inclined to think so myself, is this a scene of myth? Well, now it's from Attica originally, in the sense that it was painted, it was made in Attica. So if you're an Athenian potter or painter, or you're the owner of a workshop in which you employ a potter and painter, and you have some say in what scene is depicted, then I think you're quite likely to go for an Athenian myth. And therefore, what's quite widely thought is that this is Theseus, having rescued, or having been rescued by Ariadne from the Minotaur on Crete in Knossos, and he's taking her on board. He, of course, dumps her on Naxos, the cad, but nevertheless, if you're a Theban, what you know is that Dionysus, who is your god because he's got a Theban mother, as does, by the way, Heracles. There's a very strong connection between major gods of the Greek pantheon and Thebes in a physical, local sense. So it could be Theseus and Ariadne. Another possibility is it's Menelaus, who has recovered Helen from Troy. And so this is him taking her back with him, she having been the cause, according to the myth, of the entire 10-year Trojan War. Whatever, it's a fine kratia, which is a wine mixing bowl. And that tells you that the custom of mixing wine with water, normally 3 parts of water to 1 part of wine, they drank their wine really quite dilute, had already come into being, and this was either used at the funeral feast or had been used in life in a practice known as the symposium, where people drank together, males drank together, and the wine would be ladled out of a fine pot like this, which was then put in the grave of obviously quite a wealthy Theban man. Well, I mentioned that one of the signs of the complete change between Bronze Age and early historical Greece, post-Dark Age Greece, was the adoption of a new script, namely an alphabetic script, as opposed to the linear B syllabary of the Bronze Age. And here we see it happens to be, I think, a rather fine example of a bronze figurine dedicated, as the inscription tells us, to Phoebus, who is, that's one of the epithets of Apollo. Apollo was, together with Dionysus and with Heracles, one of the 3 most important divinities of the Thebans. Thebans, like all other Greeks, worship many, many gods and goddesses, but these were the premier 3. And the dedicator is a man called Manticos, and the mantis bit sounds like the Greek word for a prophet or a seer, somebody who in a ritual of sacrifice would inspect the entrails of the sacrificed animal, looking for signs, favorable, disfavorable. Manticos dedicated me as a gift to the far shooter. That's another Homeric epithet of Apollo, Apollo of the silver bow. And then comes the punchline, and this is very, very Greek in terms of its religious sentiment. Give something pleasing in return, and that's expressed as an order. So Manticos has done well in life, well enough to spend a considerable amount of money on a fine bronze dedication like this, which he offers up as a thank offering or as a vow. And Apollo is requested very firmly to give him back something pleasing in return. You'll notice the aesthetic is geometric. The face is triangular, as is the torso, and the head plus neck plus long, long locks is a kind of rectangle. And at the top, there is a kind of semicircular effect. There would have been a bow, there would have been possibly a lance, a spear in the right hand. And we're in the early part of the 7th century, so the sort of 670s, shall we say now. Coming down a century later, and the reason that I'm showing you what are rather fine, expensive, aesthetic objects is to counter one of the French call it canard. This is a rude comment hurled at the Thebans by their near neighbors and often enemies, the Athenians, that they were uncultured. They were Boeotian pigs, Boeotian swine. And remember Pindar, the Theban praise poet of the early 5th century. Well, he is aware of this insult and he comments on it and rebuts it, both explicitly and in his, of course, own career, his oeuvre. Anyway, about 100 of these in local marble, kouroi, as they're called. Kouros is an adolescent or late teenage or early 20s possibly, nude, completely naked male, life size. It's thought it would take about a year for a single craftsman, a sculptor, to make such a figure. Well, at this sanctuary, the Ptoion, which Ptoios is a local hero identified with Apollo, about 11 kilometers from Thebes. Over 100 of these were dedicated. So the Thebans were by no means unaesthetic or uncultured or unwilling to devote time and money to non-utilitarian aspects of life. They symbolize possibly the dedicator, that is, this is me, Apollo Ptoios, I'm offering myself to you, and it's possible that these represent actually Apollo. Well, now, I've mentioned the fact that there is a second city of Thebes, not just a city of history, which I've been looking at mainly so far, but a city of myth. And I'm just going to look at a couple of images which illustrate the fact that the myths of the Thebans were domesticated, were taken over, borrowed, adapted for the Athenian stage in the 5th century BC, when the Athenian, well, super poets, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Euripides, who between them span most of the 5th century BC, between the 470s and the 400s. They found the Thebes myths very good to think with, very good to play with, to act with, to represent in Athenian public religious festivals in honor of Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is, as I've already said, Theban. So there's a beginning sort of association. But of course, the Athenians worshipped, particularly Athenian Dionysus, associated wickedly with a Boeotian town called Eleutherai, because the Dionysus worshipped in the just at the foot of the Acropolis, in that theatre of Dionysus, where the plays were put on in the open air once or twice a year. That Dionysus actually has a Theban connection, a Boeotian connection. He's called Dionysus of Eleutherai. Eleutherai is on the border, southern Boeotia, but the Athenians, like with the Plataeans, sort of assumed it, grabbed it, took it over from the Boeotians, and in particular from the Thebans. Well, I mentioned Oedipus, poor, misguided, on the other hand, brilliantly smart Oedipus, utter disaster. One of his 2 daughters was the lady you see here, Antigone, and she's being brought before her uncle, her maternal uncle, the brother of her mother. Why? Because when Oedipus discovers the horror that he's killed his father, murdered his mother, fathered children who are also his half-siblings, he puts his eyes out and eventually goes into exile, handing over his throne to his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices. They, well, as siblings sometimes do, need I mention William and Harry at the moment, fell out in a very big way, and they actually fought each other. There was a civil war in which they killed each other, which left the throne vacant, assumed by the brother of the children's mother, Iocaste, the brother being Creon. Iocaste having killed herself when she discovered what she had done with her son and husband, Oedipus. So this is a red figure vase of the early 4th century, exported from Athens to southern Italy, where they loved Greek theatre, where they loved Athenian theatre. Antigone is most famously represented in the play by Sophocles, dated about 440 BC. Another item of Athenian manufacture found in what's called Magna Graecia, that is Great Greece, or Megali Hellas in southern Italy, is this Sphinx vase. And I put it on the screen just to show how sphinxes were represented in the Greek, the Athenian imaginary. They're female. They're not male, as they were originally in the Orient. And this happens to be a peculiarly Athenian pot, because the imagery around concerns local Athenian myths. Another scene from an Athenian-made pot, again red figure, and this is of an earlier generation than the Oedipus line. The royal houses of Thebes had particularly unfortunate history, shall we say. And Penthus is, I think, a grandson of Cadmos. There it is, way up there in the early lineage of the founding dynasty of Thebes. And according to, most famously, the play by Euripides, which some of you may have read or seen, the Bacchae. Bacchae means followers of Dionysus who are female. Alternative name for them, Maenads, which means mad women, because when they become besotted with Dionysus and his worship, they literally go out of their mind. They're ecstatic. They stand outside themselves. And so ecstatic was Agave, Penthus, King Penthus's mother, when she saw Dionysus, that she went absolutely mad and thought that Penthus was a wild animal. And she, together with her sister Ino, tears Penthus apart. And then in the play, of course, she gradually comes round. She recovers her senses, and she's holding a mask which is representing Penthus, and she realizes what she's done. She has killed her son. And so that is Theban tragedy on the Athenian stage. And I think one reason the Athenians will have enjoyed, in a schadenfreude sort of way, seeing Theban royalty messing each other up so badly, is that the Athenians and the Thebans were very often at enmity, and they were actually physically enmity at the time, much of the 5th century BC. So these sorts of things, the Athenians would have said, huh, typical. That's what the Thebans are like. Thank goodness we don't do that to each other. Well, there is a brighter side of Athenian-Theban cultural relations right at the end of the 5th century BC. And the figure at the bottom, in the middle, holding a 2-pronged, double-reeded instrument called an aulos, is actually a Theban. And his name is Pronomos, and he was the most famous aulos player in all Greece of his time. So if you were paying for a production on the Athenian stage. You're an Athenian, you're performing a public service. You've got to pay for the music, the choreography, the costumes, the sets, etc. You would try to get the services of absolutely the best aulos player. And so you might well want to hire Pronomos. Here he's shown a scene which includes even Dionysus, but together with the cast of a satyr drama. And you can see the guy actually next to Pronomos, just to his left as we look, prancing around. Well, he is a satyr, which is a combination of human and goat and horse. And at the end of all the tragedies, each playwright who wrote a tragedy, normally 3 plays for Athens, had to write a satyr drama where the chorus is provided by Satyr. So it's a sort of comedy to lighten the mood after the extreme tragedy. This is a very fancy pot. Notice where it's now in Naples, because it was exported to southern Italy and found in a tomb there and then put in the Naples Museum. Now back to history, and the last few slides, I've just got a few more, will take us through the 5th and 4th century. And this is a scene not from Thebes, but actually from one of the towns in Boeotia, which was linked politically with Thebes, because in the middle of the 5th century, after the horrors of the Persian Wars and Thebes being on the wrong side and the Athenians conquering Boeotia and actually occupying and so on, there was then a really long and unpleasant war between Sparta and its allies, including Thebes, and Athens and its allies. We call it the Peloponnesian War, and it was a war that eventually the Spartans won. Well, fighting on the Theban side with the Boeotians and so with the Spartans was this man Salgenis from Tanagra. And I'm going to come back to Tanagra in another context, but it's just to show a rather fine illustration of what a hoplite, a heavy armed infantryman, but depicted as a heroic, almost nude figure. So there's not much body armor on him. He's got a hoplite shield with emblems of a lion to show how terrifically strong he was. But in order to depict him physically, he's shown more or less nude. Well, that was the Peloponnesian War. Thebes came out of it very well, and so well that they fell out with their main ally, Sparta, to such an extent, and I'm now cutting, of course, many corners, the Thebans eventually pitch up with the Athenians, normally enemies, but they were so disgusted with the way the Spartans had treated them, though they'd played a key role as allies of the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War, the Thebans felt they were not given due justice. They were not rewarded appropriately. So, series of toings and froings, what I've called a fateful triangle, Sparta, Athens, Thebes. So ultimately, in the late 370s, Thebes and Athens are by then allied, and there is a major battle fought at a place called Leuctra in Boeotia in 371. And that is the end, to all intents and purposes, of Sparta as a major power, a military, political power in the ancient Greek world. And that's why it plays no role in the subsequent events, the major events of the rise of Macedon, the conquest of the Persian Empire, and so on. Sparta, by the 360s, is, to all intents and purposes, a spent force. Thebes, by contrast, for one decade, 371, 362, is top dog. Such an extent they frighten the Athenians, who now go back and ally with the Spartans against the Thebans. They're so frightened of the Thebans. The coloration of this, Thebes and allied states, just indicates the extent of their super alliance, if you like. the yellow could, in fact, have been extended further north into Macedon, because for 3 years, a prince of the royal house of Macedon called Philip was held in Thebes as a hostage to make sure the Macedonians did not interfere in the Theban sphere, which included Thessaly, just to the south of Macedon. So that was how powerful the Thebans were. They were able to demand from the king of Macedon that he give them as a hostage one of his sons, and they gave him Philip, who wasn't the oldest. And Philip actually goes on to become king of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, etc., etc. Well, the Thebans not only were the most powerful militarily for various reasons, military reforms, military innovations, brilliant leadership by 2 men, Epameinondas and Pelopidas. But Epameinondas, one of my favorite ancient Greeks, actually founded or helped crucially to found 2 new Greek cities. And they're both indicated on the map immediately below where it says in Latin Peloponnesos, megalopolis, the great polis, megalopolis, incorporating 40 previous communities into one big federal capital of the Arcadians, and then below it Mycenae. Mycenae's history is checkered. The Mycenaeans thought of themselves as an independent entity for hundreds of years, but for hundreds of years they were actually part of the state of the Spartans, and they were unfree. They were what the Spartans called helots. So Epameinondas, by founding Mycenae with its huge walls, 9 kilometers, still in very good nick if you go down there to visit, was actually liberating thousands of unfree Greeks who then became citizens of New Mycenae. He also integrated the Arcadians, who'd previously been at each other's throats, rather like the Boeotians very often were, on the same political basis of federalism. And one reason why people in America in particular looked back to the Thebans was that they saw them as early ancestors of a new kind of doing politics, not individual city by city, but groups of cities that would submit to a central area, central body, but they would surrender some of their sovereignty in the name of greater collaboration and solidarity. That hegemony lasted only about a decade, because then, for various reasons, the rise of Macedon put paid to Thebes' exclusive power. This is just an illustration of how unity among the Boeotians was symbolized through coinage. This happens to be a coin from Thespiae, hence Thess, but the symbol of the shield was common to all Boeotian silver coinage wherever it was struck. And well, I said that the story ended rather sadly. Immediately before the Thebans revolted and were destroyed, their city was wiped out. Big battle in Boeotia at Cheronia, which is Charonia, as I say it in English, in Boeotia. And the Macedonians trounced the united forces of Athens and Thebes. The cavalry of the Macedonians led by an 18-year-old Alexander. This is 338 BC, and that symbolized the total conquest or domination, the hegemony of mainland Greece by Macedon. Moving on, Thebes has been restored, 315, never achieves anything like its fame, greatness, power of its classical past. But within Boeotia, a style of life with some ease and comfort is achieved. And this female figurine of clay, terracotta from Tanagra, is, I think, a nice symbol of how life was comfortable again in Boeotia, if not particularly exciting. This belongs to the 3rd or 2nd century BC, the so-called Hellenistic period, before the Roman conquest. Now I'm leaping you forward, and I'm going to end with a couple of slides, one of which is a famous painting by the French early 19th century court painter Ingres, who was, of course, Napoleon's court painter, particularly fascinated with the myth of Oedipus and the riddle of the Sphinx. And there she is, without any question, female on the left, and a quizzical Oedipus, rather confidently, very young man, is giving her the eye and also answering her riddle. And then I'm particularly fond, this is just a particular foible of myself, of the Ballet Russe, the neoclassical ballet company founded by Serge Diaghilev in the early 20th century. And his main second man, the man who was together with him the most important person in running and founding the Ballet Russe, was Leon Bakst, a painter and designer of costumes. And in 1911, he wrote and he staged a version of a Boeotian ballet, though the myth was taken not from a Greek source, but from a Latin, from Ovid's Metamorphoses, but it's set in Boeotia, and here you see a Boeotian female in splendid costume. So thank you so much if you have been listening. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen.
Professor Cartledge, can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well, Nick, thanks.
Firstly, thank you for putting Thebes on the map, and an excellent sort of presentation. I might just start off the questions with just two very quick questions. This Thebes of Viotia, and there's also Thebes of ancient Egypt. Is there any link between the two? And second question, did Thebes have any colonies outside what's today modern day mainland Greece?
I caught the first one. I didn't quite catch the end of the second one, but I'll answer the first one. Egyptian Thebes is mentioned in the earliest surviving work of ancient Greek literature, namely Homer's Iliad, extraordinarily. And the difference, or the point of contrast, is that whereas Thebes has only 7 gates in Greece, the Egyptian Thebes has 100. And it's very striking how Orchomenos tends to get a rather better billing in the Iliad than does Thebes. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the tradition of epic poetry that Homer is the heir to is not the Thebans' own tradition of epic. So it's a rival version, and I think actually playing down Thebes. Second question, could you please repeat the end of it again?
Thebes itself, did it have any colonies outside what's today modern day mainland Greece?
Right, well, the answer to that is nil. And Thebes simply was not a colonizer. Sparta has maybe 1 or 2. Corinth has several. The most prolific colonizer, that is founder of settlements from itself, is Miletus, and they were around the Black Sea. Miletus was attributed with no fewer than 100, but actually Thebes being inland, suppose it wanted to expand, which was actually one of the main reasons why Greeks left the homeland in the 8th, 7th, 6th centuries. There wasn't enough land. Well, Thebes could simply expand in its immediate vicinity. And I think that accounts for why when other cities, Corinth is sending off people to Syracuse, for example, Thera, the island of Thera, is sending people to Cyrene in what's today Libya. Thebes didn't feel the need, in the same way really Sparta didn't. Sparta conquered locally a massive territory.
During the course of the day, we had a question that was emailed to us from Christopher Spiropoulos, and it's regarding Epameinondas. Is there any historical source that mentions his appearance? I find it odd that a man of his caliber wasn't made into a bust or statue. Do you think there was some evidence of what he looked like prior to Alexander burning the city?
Yes, there were ancient statues of Epameinondas, and there are modern attempts to recreate what he conceivably looked like. But the fact of the matter is that before really the later 5th century, and even more, before the middle of the 4th century, the idea of a portrait statue, that is, one that would physically represent what some individual actually looked like, as opposed to a statue that represented an individual symbolically, but actually had standard features, was a novelty. So some people think a particular stone statue found in Ostia in Italy, the port of Rome, one of the ports of Rome, depicting Themistocles, might conceivably have some connection to an actual image of Themistocles who died in the 460s BC. There is a famous bust of Pericles wearing a helmet, and we know that the original was actually bronze, it wasn't marble or any other stone, and we know the name of the artist, he was Chrysilas, and the reason it's mentioned in the sources is why was Pericles shown in a non-military situation, i.e. not in battle, wearing a helmet? And the explanation was that apparently he really did wear a helmet in non-battle situations because he was embarrassed by the shape of his head, which looked like an onion. I mean, this may be all nasty tittle-tattle. It may have some basis in truth, but it's not before really the middle of the 4th century, and particularly Alexander, and he was the main instigator of this notion that you can use images of yourself in 3D, not just on a coin, and not in 2D, not just in a painting or in a mosaic, but in a full-blooded bronze or marble statue to project your power where you physically are not. You are there in imagination, and you are representing your power through a 3D artistic image. So it's really Alexander the Great who gives portrait sculpture its lease of life, which then of course becomes absolutely standard and universal in the West.
Question here from Irene Yavas. If you visit Thebes today, what will you see of historical Thebes? I'd like to believe part of the answer is my background. That's what I try to put on there for tonight's seminar. So Thebes of today, what will you see? I'm sure
you're looking at behind at Byzantine or late Roman walling. Like Sparta, which was founded, modern Sparta, in 1834, modern day Thebes is smack bang on top of ancient Thebes. And there's no surprise about that because of the Cadmos, the Acropolis, which constitutes the focal point, why anybody would want to settle. If you want security, then you've got this ready-made defensible Acropolis. So any knowledge of ancient Thebes before the 19th century has to be, unless it's right on top of the Cadmos, which has been extensively excavated over the years, beginning in the late 19th and then going on through the 20th century, right up to the present, you're mainly dealing with what are called rescue excavations. So say you want to build new fiber optic cabling, you want to build a new gas line or a new aquifer or something like that, you dig down and you hit ancient remains. So by and large, if you travel around, you don't get a very strong impression. It's very like Sparta, actually, the impression you get, very unlike the center of Athens, though of course the center of Athens is the exact opposite, where all the modern stuff has been cleared away from the top of the Acropolis down in the Agora and so on. And so you just see a vision of an antiquity. But Thebes, sadly, is one of those towns where it's very difficult to get at anything ancient at all, I mean, of any period. There is a compensation, and I'm slightly ashamed that I've not been able to take advantage of this myself. I knew the old museum, But since then, I think it's within the last 5 years, a new, spanking new museum has been constructed. You can access it by various online links. Very, very good. You can have a virtual tour of the Thebes Museum in various ways, and I recommend that very strongly. But I've not actually myself seen the new display, which is, I'm told, really quite wonderful.
Okay, we've got quite a backlog of questions, around sort of 6 or 8 questions to go. So please refrain from sending any more questions, otherwise we'll be here till sort of midnight. So no questions, please, and I'll try and get through the ones that have already been sent. A question from John Katsoulis. The various rotating alliances and rivalries parallel Thucydides' idea of states being trapped by their various anxieties and jealousies and changing their behaviors accordingly. Where did it go wrong for Thebes, for the Thebans?
Well, the other way is to say, where did it go right? Because they chose the right side in the Peloponnesian War. Their alliances shifting in the first 3 to 4 decades of the 4th century saw them emerge ultimately as number one. And then it was something they couldn't have anticipated or predicted. No one could. The rise of Macedon under Philip, which put paid not just to them, but to any power of old Greece that tried to resist. Going back, which I didn't look at in any great detail, when Thebes first emerges as any sort of regional power, we're talking about the later 6th century BC, so in the half century or so before the great Persian invasion of 480, by 500, Thebes is a quite significant player, and therefore, which side it took in the Greco-Persian Wars was a matter of considerable importance. If they had gone with Athens and Sparta, that would have helped definitely the resistance. And there is a famous passage, it's the Battle of Thermopylae, book 7 of Herodotus, where there are 400 Thebans fighting on the same side as Leonidas. Were they there under constraint? Were they there as volunteers because they're patriots, as it were? They're Greeks who think that their city has betrayed Hellas. We don't know for sure, but the problem is we don't have a Theban source. What we do have is later recriminations. The fact that the dominant government of Thebes was oligarchic, just a few rich Thebans ruled Thebes. They thought the Persians were going to win. So did their neighbors to the north in Thessaly, and so did every Greek, really, as far up into the Persian Empire, the Black Sea. So right down to central Greece, as far as Thebes, all of those were on the Persian side. So I'm not saying I defend the Thebans or exonerate them completely for their lack of patriotism, but it's totally understandable, put it another way.
A question from Thea Vasnidis. Is there any record of how Philip viewed the Thebans from his time there as a hostage?
That's right. No, there isn't, because we've got no evidence of Philip himself from his own words. And the historians who wrote about him, one historian actually thought that Thebes was the greatest man that Europe had ever produced. And he wrote a history of Greece around Philip. He called it Philippica, things that Philip did, the deeds of Philip, as it were. This is a man from the island of Chios called Theopompus. But it's all inference by me, by others. Imagine yourself, you're born in 382, and when you're about 14, 368, you're sent off as a hostage under house arrest. 14, you're just coming into your manhood and your sense of identity and so on. On the other hand, the compensation, you're in the house of a leading Theban called Epameinondas, who pitches up in the 360s, 350s, when Thebes is quite a big deal. He leads expeditions and so on. And you're in the Thebes of Epameinondas and Pelopidas, Thebes at its height of power. And think about, if you're a smart guy, and Philip clearly was, the lessons that you're going to learn about how to conduct things militarily, politically. Very interesting indeed, but it's all speculation.
Okay, I just might combine the next two questions slightly. Are Sophocles' Theban plays part of the official Theban myth, or did he himself just make those wonderful stories? And could you say something more about Pindar's connection with Thebes? Surely he helped improve the reputation of the city.
Right, so they're quite different questions, though they have a linkage in terms of cultural matters. The so-called Theban trilogy of Sophocles is not a trilogy in the strong sense that it was written as three joined plays produced for one single performance. Unlike, for example, the Oresteia of Aeschylus, 458, three plays, interlinked, sequential, one performance at the theatre of Dionysus in the festival of Dionysus. So the plays are scattered in time. The Antigone about 440, the Oedipus, the king, Tyrannos in Greek, about 430, and then the At Colonus, published, that is performed posthumously, written of course by Sophocles, but produced and presented by his grandson after his death right at the end of the 5th century. So the plays cover 40 odd years in terms of their span. How far were they Theban? How far were they Sophoclean? Well, one can say of all ancient Greek myths that there was never a single absolutely authoritative version of any myth. It was always open for anybody to try to get his new version established as the latest authoritative one. So the Thebans invent the myths. We don't have the originals. So we don't know what the subject matter, what the plot, as it were, that Sophocles inherited was. And we can only speculate that, for example, he bumped up the role of Antigone. Now, in the play, in the myth, she's a young girl, she's unmarried, she's a virgin, she's about, what, 15, 16? And yet, in Sophocles, you imagine her as a fully mature woman, speaking out as if she was a man on the stage to her uncle, telling him what he should do and how she's going to behave, and defying him as if she were an adult male. Well, did the Thebans think of their Antigone as quite so masculine and out and robust as who knows, but I doubt it personally. They would, I think, have more emphasized the tragedy, the fact that she was an ineffectual, sad girl who did her best, but had really no chance up against the male-dominated Theban mythical royal society. So that's the answer to that one.
Yeah.
And the other one, remind me?
It was about Pindar. Could you say more about his connection with Thebes? Yeah.
Pindar was, of course, the living counter-argument to the notion that all Boeotians are merely interested in what goes into their bellies. So they're pigs, swine, snuffling around in the trough. Pindar's poetry was elevated to an extraordinary degree. And of course, the language, the dialect, and so on is not innovated by him, but the imagery, the expression, the playing with, the knowledge, the learning, shall we say, that goes into his poetry. But of course, his victors come from all over the Greek world. They're not just Theban victors. In my book, I discuss those, I think it's 5 Thebans for whom, and some of them were actually underage. They weren't adult males, they were adolescent males. And 2 of them, I think, were in chariots races, and so not individual competitions. They owned the chariots. They didn't themselves race the chariots. So Pindar's particular connection with Theban victors is not especially strong, though where he gets a chance, he does dilate on Theban mythology and talk about himself as a Theban. He's probably actually from a little village called Kainoskephali, heads of the dog, and then he moves and he lives, and of course he has a house in Thebes itself.
Okay, a question from Joseph. What happened to the citizens of Thebes after it was destroyed by Alexander the Great? Were all males executed, and what happened to the women and children?
Right, well, it's a sorry tale, and of course we are dependent on the contemporary, or actually not very contemporary, historical sources, but we're told that 6,000 of those Theban males who were not killed in the fighting were sold into slavery. Women and children entirely sold into slavery, dispersed. And it's a very similar situation whenever any ancient Greek city was physically destroyed. This happened, by the way, to Plataea in 427 BC during the Peloponnesian War, in 373 BC, just before the Theban hegemony. The Thebans were rather hostile to Plataea because they kept taking the Athenian side and not joining the Boeotian federal state. They simply would disperse to the nearest place of safety beyond the frontiers. So, for example, Thebans after destroying Plataea in 427, the Plataeans went to Athens, not surprisingly, because they're allies of Athens, and they lived in Athens until it was safe for them to go back again, until the city was rebuilt. So we don't know the answer. In other words, we've not got lots of evidence of Thebans being buried elsewhere in the Greek world after the destruction of Thebes in 335. But those who survived, and of course a number did, because they're the ones who come back in 315, will have probably gone to relatives by marriage or by birth who had scattered, who had emigrated for whatever reason. It's just something we don't know about, but Athens would be the nearest obvious place to go to for them in 335. Allies of the Thebans, anti-Macedonian, and therefore presumably the Athenians would be willing to be, and they had a tradition, the Athenians, of being kind to exiles.
A question here from George Macris. Did Alexander destroy Thebes as payback to Philip being held hostage, either on the orders of Philip himself, or was there another agenda by Alexander to annihilate any other Greek city-state or people who are offering any type of resistance?
Right. Well, in my talk, I answered to the effect of the second of those options, but I don't think it would have been as payback for his father being treated badly by Thebes in the 360s. One reason for my saying that is that there is a doubt, there is a very serious doubt over Alexander's own role in the assassination of his father. Had Philip not been assassinated in 336 at the wedding of his daughter, who was Alexander's full sister, it's a famous wedding procession, he gets to the theatre in what's today Vergina, and he's then struck down by an assassin, one of his bodyguards. Had he not been, Alexander was not part of his plan for the actual fighting and conquest in Asia. He would have been left behind in Pella, the Macedonian capital. There is a thought that the main person who wanted Philip assassinated was his ex-wife, Olympias, one of his 7 wives, wives, by the way, and she was Alexander's mother, as she was the mother of Cleopatra, the lady who was getting married when Philip was assassinated. And so therefore, I don't think Alexander had any reason to feel particularly kindly towards Philip personally. However, in 348 BC, Philip, having emerged, first of all, from within Macedonia, he'd got Macedonia unified. He then expands to its immediate boundaries, and the immediately neighboring political entity on his southeast is the Chalcidian Federation led by Olynthus. Well, he fights them, and in 348, he destroys Olynthus totally. And it's never reoccupied, unlike Thebes, it was never reoccupied. So when excavators went to Olynthus in the 1930s, they found the city as it had been left in 348. I think quite extraordinary. Private houses, public buildings, excavations still going on, by the way, Greek, American. So that, I think, is the model. Any entity that offers resistance of such a kind that it threatens to be a spur to others to revolt, that is, to resist the expansion of Macedon, they're going to get the chop as a symbolic gesture of exclusion, that they be wiped off the map. That's what's going to happen to you, mate, if you consider even thinking about rebelling against me. And so that's why I think Thebes got the chop. But there was another reason, which is this divide and rule. Treat Athens nicely, Thebes very harshly. You're playing on the old Thebes-Athens enmity. The Athenians did not a damn thing after the destruction of Thebes, while Alexander is away in Asia, to resist, to revolt, to rebel, until Alexander died. And that, I think, in other words, that policy, treat Thebes really nastily, treat Athens really nicely, paid off.
And just one final question from your namesake, Yanni Cartledge.
Yanni, Yasu Yanni, I'm so pleased that you managed to turn up.
Once linear A is finally deciphered, do you expect there to be a linguistic connection between linear A and linear B?
I do not. And I think the reason it's not been deciphered is precisely because it's not an Indo-European language. I think it's probably a Semitic language. In other words, one of the family of Middle Eastern languages that includes all sorts of Aramaic, for example, Hurrian, Luvian. That's a favored candidate is Luvian. But since that's not deciphered, that doesn't really help. And it's just one of those mysteries. And there is, of course, one artifact which moderns argue amongst themselves, not just, what does it say, but is it a fake? Because it has lots of linear A symbols, but not only linear A. This is, those of you who know it, the Festos disc. And so Festos is one of the major palace sites of Bronze Age Crete, in central Crete, south of Knossos, Heraklion. And well, is it a real thing, a real object? People periodically come up with decipherments, but none has yet convinced everybody.
Thank you for that answer. And Jenny, you may also probably want to have a chat with sort of Brent Davis at the University of Melbourne. He's done a lot of research in this area as well. Look, all that remains for us to sort of thank you, Professor Cartledge. Thank you for making yourself available. All the best for the year, and hope to have you back sometime in the near future as well. Thanks once again for quite a delightful talk, and I encourage you all to consider purchasing his recently released book, Thebes, the Forgotten City. It's quite a nice story.
Yassas and Efcharistoumi Baraboli. Absolute pleasure to be with you. Bye.